I have to say, I mean, squash is kind of boring, but this really livens it up. That's flavor central right there. Welcome back to the Fermentation Adventure. This week we have an end of summer recipe that is refreshing and super fragrant. We are making fermented summer squash pickles.
So this week we're looking at one way to preserve squash. Now you've often probably heard it referred to as pickled squash, and it's not actually pickled. We're not using any vinegar in this recipe. In fact, we're using the fermentation method. And so we'll be creating its own acetic acid, which will actually kind of pickle itself. And it's really healthy this way and creates a lot of probiotics. So we're so excited about using this method for our squash.
Yeah, I know, it kind of tastes like vinegar. And if you're growing any of this squash at home right now, if you have a garden, you're probably coming out of your ears with so many squash because it produces so heavy. So maybe some of that you could actually ferment, and this is a really tasty recipe today. Join us on this journey to explore the world of fermentation.
If you'd like to learn how to make ferments like these, start now by clicking subscribe and hitting that bell so you don't miss a thing.
Let's get started. So we are making 1 quart of this really good recipe. Now this is summer squash, and there's one ingredient in there that's gonna make this taste fabulous.
I'm so excited. It's also a summer ingredient, but can be found year round.
If you have a garden right now, you're most likely growing it, and you probably have a bunch of it. So our first ingredient for this recipe is
Red onion.
Now technically, if you don't have a red onion and you have a yellow onion or a white onion, you can use that also, but I think the red onion adds a little bit of color.
Actually, I really love fermented red onion specifically. It especially gets really sweet and tangy after the fermentation process. So for this quart recipe, we're going to be using only 1/4 of this red onion.
All right, let's get to it. So what I'm gonna do first is chop off both ends of this red onion and then just quarter it. And then from there, I'm gonna slice it into thin slices so we have something that's easier to work with. Look at that beautiful onion. You gotta be careful when you're cutting onions because if you don't have a sharp enough knife, they get a little bit slippery. Compost! So what do we have growing in the garden lately?
Like our fig tree produced really well this year, so exciting. But it's kind of coming to an end.
Yeah.
Ooh, what we do have are persimmons.
Oh yeah, that's coming in October.
Yeah, so we still have a little time on that, but they're looking really good.
We kind of had a little bit of a disaster too. We had a bandit come and steal a giant, beautiful bunch of bananas. What are you gonna do?
That makes me want to cry about as much of these as these onions are making me cry.
I'm just gonna move these onions to the side because we're gonna use them for later. And these we don't actually need, so we're gonna save those for later too.
The next ingredient is garlic. And for this recipe, we're gonna be using 4 garlic cloves. Garlic is super important to have really good additional flavor.
So I'm just gonna peel this first, get all the skin off. Cutting the ends off, it's a lot easier to take off the skin. And then you smash it, the skins just come right off. It's got a little trick. So now we have our onions and our garlic, our 2 aromatics. So we're gonna start adding a little bit of this to the jar.
Wow, that really does smell so good. I think we're ready for the next ingredient.
So the next ingredient is our summer squash. And we have 2 different varieties that we're using. We're using zucchini, which is nice and green, and we're using yellow squash. We really only need enough to fill the jar. These are the smallest ones that I could find in the store.
We're gonna be using 2 small summer squash or 1 medium. Since we're using both for colors, we're going to use probably the entire little one and about half of the zucchini. We first have to wash our squash. And since I just washed these in our regular tap water, which is chlorinated, I'm going to make sure to dry it off so that there is no chlorine left, because chlorine will kill your ferment, and we don't want that.
So now we want to cut up our squash into somewhat of sticks or spears. I think I'm going to measure maybe up to about there and cut it in half. Now I also like to cut off the little blossom end, just like when we're making dill pickles, because if you leave the blossom end on, it tends to go soft on the blossom end first. So now I'm just going to cut these into fourths and make them more into spears. Check these out. Does that look like a pickle to you or what?
Yeah, it looks really good. I like to find them as small as possible because the seeds inside, as you see on here, will be the first thing to get soft. If you can find one that's kind of a little less mature and doesn't have as many seeds in there, you're gonna get a firmer pickle.
I'm gonna go ahead and make this yellow squash about the same size as the zucchini and start cutting it into spears. So next we want to start filling the jar, and it's a good thing I have a Tetris expert here. So she knows exactly how to pack this thing.
We're going to hold it at a little bit of an angle and start sliding them in, and then keep sliding them in until they kind of all stay solid and straight up. We're doing good. I think I put about half of the jar already filled, so we may not use all the zucchini that we cut up. And for fun, I'm gonna put all the zucchini on one side and all the summer squash on the other side. I guess it worked. All right, we got it in there pretty tight. That's about all the space we have for in zucchini. So we have some of these extra onions, and we're gonna just fit them in between if we can. Kind of squish them in between.
That jar is really packed.
But it still has a little room, and we haven't put all of our ingredients because we're gonna wait to the end to see how much room we have left. We still have more ingredients.
Our next ingredient is very fragrant, and if you have a garden and it's summertime, you're probably growing it. It is fresh basil.
We're so excited to use some fresh basil in a ferment.
It's amazing. Fresh basil will go a long way in flavor, especially in cooking, but in fermentation, amazing.
We're going to use about 1 stalk of basil, which equates to about 8 large leaves. That sounds like a lot, but man, is this so good.
Yeah, feel free to use more, feel free to use less. That's what we're using today. I think it'll taste great.
I wish this one had come from the garden, but I did get it at the store, so I'm going to wash it really well. Remember when we grew it?
Yeah, in the past we have grown gigantic basil bushes. We bought one plant that was an organic basil plant. I think it was for $5.
Yeah, if that.
And we've been growing it year after year after year. And with $5, we have thousands of seeds. It's amazing how much basil you can get when you let it go to seed and just keep saving the seeds and replanting them year after year. This jar is super packed, and to get that basil in there, I think Miss Tetris expert is gonna have to tell us her secret.
I'm going to remove one of the pieces and stuff it into the side because it's so beautiful when you see it on the side for fermenting. And then we just have to put the piece back in. When you squish it down in there, kind of takes the basil with it. And you want to add anything that fits that you had remaining, like your garlic cloves. You can either stuff them in between a little bit where there's room, or put them right on top like I'm going to do for some of these additional onions.
Oh, I have to say, if I can smell that basil, it is just in the air. That smells so good. What we want to do is add some kind of a tannin, and that'll keep it very crisp. You can even add bay leaves, grape leaves. But since we're right here in Florida, we have something right in our own backyard. So let's go grab it. This is a trick that we use often to keep them very crunchy. You need something that has a lot of tannins. What we like to do is use these oak leaves. Now here in Florida, we have live oaks. We're just gonna pick a couple of these, maybe put 1 or 2 in the jar, and it should keep our pickles very crunchy. Okay, so we have our oak leaves. Now we're really just gonna stuff these down into the jar, kind of like we did the basil, but I don't think it's gonna be as hard. So the next ingredient, we are getting into our spices. And actually we only have 1 spice today for you. That is mustard seeds.
We're going to be using 1 teaspoon of mustard seeds. It's super helpful to use bulk spices. Not only has it saved us a lot of money, but it's pretty cool that we rarely run out, so we never have to run to the store just to get 1 type of spice. It's really annoying.
And for our final ingredient, we need salt. And we like to use a brine ratio of 2 teaspoons of salt to 1 cup of non-chlorinated water. And the reason we don't want chlorine in our water is because we're using the natural lacto-fermentation process. We definitely don't want any kind of chlorine that's going to kill the life, because the life in our ferments, which is the bacteria and yeast, are going to eat the sugars that are present in our squash. And we want to keep those happy, so they're creating all the nice acetic acid, which is going to preserve our squash.
Some parts of the world may have water that does not have chlorine, and you're in luck there. But where we are, there is definitely chlorine in the water. So you can use something like a filter, or you can purchase distilled water or something that's already removed the chlorine from it. And from our experience, when you pack a jar like this, a 1-quart jar, we really only need 1 cup of non-chlorinated water. And we're going to dissolve our 2 teaspoons of salt to make our salt brine.
So now we are just about ready for the fermentation process. And in lactofermentation, we're using a salt brine, and the most important thing is to keep everything below the brine. Anything that pops above the brine exposed to oxygen, it might actually get mold. So what you could do is you could put like a little jelly jar or something, but we just need a weight, and we have these special glass weights that we love using. It just fits into the mouth of the jar, and it weighs everything below the brine.
And what happens when you push down this weight in here, the water can sometimes come up a little bit high. I mean, you're taking up space with that weight, so you might need to remove a little bit of water, or you might need to add a little bit of water to make sure that everything is below the brine, but also that it's not overflowing.
The next thing that's really important in lactofermentation, like I mentioned, if anything comes into contact with oxygen, there could be mold. So one thing we love to do is to add these little fermentation lids. And they're made of silicone. All you have to do is place it right on top and then screw your mason jar lid right to the top of it. If you'd like to check out where to get those, we'll put links in the description below. Okay, we are ready for the fermentation process.
And I'm so excited! But the top question you all want to know is, how long should this ferment on the counter at room temperature?
So these are similar to dill pickles, where you can have a half sour or full sour. And these are pretty soft, so what we're gonna do is in between 3 and 5 days and see where we end up.
So we're going to follow this through the fermentation process and show you what it looks like every day so we can see what to look for during the process.
After 2 days, we're starting to see the first signs of fermentation. The brine is starting to turn a bit cloudy, and we're starting to see a few bubbles appear. After 3 days, the brine is cloudy, and at first glance not much has changed, but when we move the jar we see a lot more bubbles. After 4 days, we're now seeing a little sediment at the bottom, which is a healthy byproduct from the fermentation process, and we're still seeing many big bubbles when we move the jar. We now have a side-by-side comparison for you. This one we just made, and this one has been fermenting for 4 days, so let's check it out and see what it looks like. Yeah, very, very interesting.
Oh my gosh, really big difference. Notice that the red onion has turned a little bit pink in the one that's been fermenting. I think it may be ready.
We've also had tons of bubbles, but the real question is, what does it taste like and what does it smell like?
We of course have to remove the weight.
Oh, wow.
Look at all those bubbles.
That really smells very fragrant. I mean, the first thing that hits me immediately is the basil.
Yes, and it's also kind of tangy. You can smell that. The color looks really wonderful. It's not too cloudy, it's not slimy, it's not too thick. The brine should still stay very liquidy. If anything happens to your brine and becomes thick, you might have got a bacteria in there that should not have been there, or overtook the good bacteria.
But there is no mold on this, and it looks beautiful, so let's give it a taste test.
We're actually going to get to taste test a number of things. We have the onions and the 2 different types of squash. If you pick a smaller squash that doesn't have the seeds, then you're not going to have that issue. If you use those oak tree leaves, then most likely it will stay a lot crunchier. Should we try?
Yeah, let's do it. Ooh, yum.
Perfect flavor.
Wow. It's just a little bit sour, and oh, I swear that basil. I think this has got to be some killer secret ingredient that maybe we might have to put in other ferments.
Definitely. I really like the herbs in there. And typically we'll use dried herbs, but this fresh herb I think has added so much more amazing flavor.
Let's try the onion.
Let's see if it still has a bite. They taste like they have sugar on them.
Delicious.
My favorite are the onions.
This had gone 4 days. I think even 3 days would have been fine.
So you may want to eat these within maybe 6 months of putting them in the refrigerator.
Yeah, maybe even sooner. We hope you have enjoyed turning this squash into something super flavorful. If you like this video, give us a like. Don't forget to subscribe. We appreciate every one of you and love all the comments and messages that we get from all over the world. Share this with a friend and get out there
and create some culture. Wait for the ice maker. Patiently waiting. Cut.